Bava Batra Daf Zayin Amud Beis, and Etrog is not a Citron. Matna להחזיר. There are different dimensions of value in an object. An object could just be a commodity, but it can be so much more than a commodity. So if I borrow Meish's golden Rolex and I lose it, and I say to Meish, don't worry, I've lost it, but I'll pay for it, whatever it's worth. So there's value in the watch. It's worth a certain amount of money. I've lost the watch, I'll give him the money, everything's good. But one could have a situation where Meish would say to me, you can't pay me for the watch. This watch was my great-grandfather's watch. It's been in my family for 4 generations. I don't want the money. I want the watch. What do you do then? That's a value that goes far beyond the commodity. So sometimes it's just an object. I've lost this golden Rolex, I'll get you another one. Sometimes I've lost this golden Rolex, I'll give you the value of the golden Rolex. But sometimes the value is far beyond the commodity that is actually we're concerned with. And we see this in the case of an Etrog, that an Etrog during Sukkot is much more than a Citron. And we'll see what its dimensions are. One of the dinim of an Etrog is that it has to be lachem, it has to be your own. You've got to own your Etrog. If you've got to own your Etrog, how can you use an Etrog that isn't yours? For example, the Rashbam tells us that in his shul there was only one Etrog. We just take it for granted. You go to the Matmonim market and you've got thousands, hundreds and thousands of Etrogim to choose from, and you're very fussy and picky as to which one you want. In the Rashbam shul there was one Etrog. How was everybody yotze with the Etrog? So we come on to the din of Rova on our daf. Etrog ze natun lecha b'matana al-manat shetachzireu li. If I give you my Etrog on condition you give it back to me after you've used it, netalo v'yatza bo, he can take it and use it and he's yotze. Hechziro, and I said you may use it. Hechziro yatza. If you return it to me, you were yotze, then you did the mitzvah. But if you don't return the Etrog to me, you didn't fulfill the condition of the gift. I gave you a conditional gift. It's yours on condition you give it back to me. If you didn't give it back to me, it was never yours. If it was never yours, you weren't yotze. You haven't done the mitzvah. Kamash malan, this teaches us an important principle, de matana manat להחזיר shma matana, that if I give you a gift on timeshare, I'm only giving you the gift for a period of time. But during that time, it's yours. It's not on loan. There's a difference between having something on loan, which means it's never yours, and giving it to you as a gift, which means it is yours. You own it for that time. The only thing is that ownership is conditional upon you ultimately giving it back to me. That's how we get around the issue of the Etrog, and from that we learn the principle that matana manat להחזיר works. That's the one din we have on our daf. We have another din. Omar Rava Omar Rav Nachman, shor ze natun lecha b'matana al manat shetachzireu li. A similar case. Here's an ox. We're not talking about an Etrog, we're just talking about an ox. Here's an ox. It's yours on condition you return it to me. What happens if higdisho v'hiziro? What happens if the owner of the ox wants to be, the borrower of the ox, the buyer, this person who received the gift, wants to be a little nasty, so he says, okay, I'll give you back the ox. But before he gives him back the ox, he donates the ox to the Beis HaMikdash. We've just said, matana manat להחזיר shma matana, it's mine, this belongs to me. If during this period it belongs to me, I can be makdish it, I can dedicate it to the temple. If I did so, you can no longer use it. Here's your ox. You better take it to the temple because there's nothing you can do with it. You can't get any benefit from the ox. What is the din there? Says Rav Nachman, Hareze mukdash umuchzar. Since he returns the ox, the hekdesh works. If he would not return the ox, then of course the gift wasn't a gift to begin with, and he had no right to donate it to the Beis HaMikdash because he doesn't own it. But if he does return the ox, then he is the owner of the ox. If he's the owner of the ox, he can be makdish the ox, provided he gives the ox back. He delivers the ox back. He says, you wanted an ox, here's the ox. The fact that I have stripped the ox of its value by donating it to the Beis HaMikdash, you didn't say I have to give you an ox at full value. You just wanted your ox. Your ox's name was Harry the Ox. And here's Harry the Ox, exactly the same as he was. It just, there's a spiritual component to him that wasn't there before. What's he giving him back? A useless ox. That's not any good. Says Rav Nachman, what has he not given him back? He gave him back exactly what he took. If you look at the world just as a commodity, as a set of commodities, as objects, you gave me the object on condition I give you the object back. I gave it back. I did some spiritual hocus pocus in the meantime. That doesn't affect the fact that I'm giving you back the ox. And Omar Ravashi says, Ravashi, let's sort this out. Ravashi, and this is how the halach is chazina. You've got to have a look. You're right. If he just said, here's the ox on condition you return him, I've placed a condition that is just a transaction. Bring the ox back to me. But if you add the word li, bring the ox back for me, then I'm saying I want an ox that I can use. I want an ox that I own. Just the same as lachem in the posuk about the Etrog means an Etrog that I own. Li means an ox that I own. And if you've taken ownership away and donated the ox to the Beis Hamikdash and returning to me this ox that I can't use, that's not called li, and therefore it doesn't work. That's how Rav Ashi paskins. What's interesting is we have a Gemara in Nedorim. All the Daf Yomi people will remember the Gemara on Daf Memches in Nedorim, where the Chachamim said, Kol matana she'ina she'im hikdisha tehei mekudeshet eina matana. Any gift that I give to you, and I make a condition that you can't be makdish it, eina matana, it's not a matana. A gift that cannot be, because the capacity to dedicate to the Beis Hamikdash is one of the indicators of ownership. When we look in halacha, there are a few things we look. Does this really belong to you or doesn't it? There are a few things we look at. Could you be mekadesh and isha? If you used it to marry a woman, would that be okay? Because you've got to marry a woman with something that is yours. That's why the rabbi says under the chuppah, is this ring yours? Did you buy it? It must be yours. So also, if you can be mekadesh a woman with an object, that's a sign that it belongs to you. If you can be makdish, if you can give it to the Beis Hamikdash, it's a sign that it's yours. But if you don't have the authority to give this object to the Beis Hamikdash, then it was never yours, and it wasn't a gift, it was just something that was borrowed. That being the case, our question becomes, so how does it work with an Etrog? If I say to you, let's look at what we decided, what Rav Ashi taught us in the case of the ox, and let's apply that to the Etrog, although the Rava's piece on the Etrog didn't go into this question. What happens if I don't say, here's this Etrog on condition that you give it back? I say on condition you give it back to me. That means I want the Etrog back in a usable form, which means you cannot give it to the Beis Hamikdash. You cannot donate it to the Beis Hamikdash because then it would have no value. If you're not allowed to donate it to the Beis Hamikdash, is it yours to start with? No, it isn't. If it isn't yours, it's not lachem. So why didn't Rava say it? Depends. What does Rava say? He says, he actually uses those words. Even if I say on condition you give it back to me, it's a good matana, it's a good gift. But based on the Gemara in Nedorim and the way that Rava works Rav Ashi works with the case of the ox, why should the Etrog work? Since you cannot be makdish it, how can you give it back? You can't give it back to me in the form that I wanted it. I said shitachzirei li. To answer that, we've got to use the Rosh. There's a Rosh in Chuvas where the Rosh says, it's clear, as in the case of Mesha's golden Rolex, you'll notice it's no longer my golden Rolex. Now it's all of a sudden it's Mesha's golden Rolex. But that's okay. In the case of Mesha's golden Rolex, if I lose it, I pay him for it. And says the Rosh, ki mali hu mali damav. We're talking about value. We're not talking about a thing. It doesn't have to be a thing. A commodity at the end of the day is a store of value. And if I've lost the object, I can replace it with value. I've lost the Etrog, I'll pay for the Etrog. It doesn't mean that the Etrog, that the gift is not a valid gift, because there is a way to give it back to me. I can't give you the actual Etrog because I've given it to the Beis Hamikdash, but I can give you the value for the Etrog and go buy another one. And so there is a way to return it. But that doesn't work too well either. If you turn the page, we've got a run in Sukkot. The Ran says, what happens in our shuls, people don't actually say the formula. They don't articulate. Here's this lulav on condition that you give it back. And do they say to me or they don't say to me? They don't know all those halachas. Somebody's standing in shul, he hasn't got a lulav and esrog. He says, can I borrow your lulav and esrog? You say, sure, you give it to him. But borrowing doesn't help. It's got to be yours. Says the Ran, it doesn't matter. We know what people mean. When people borrow a lulav and esrog, they mean, I want to borrow it in a way that I can use it. A way that I can use it means that you're giving it to me, I'm not lahachzir. And we assume that intention. The Ran goes on to say and says, if we are assuming intention, then we stavre dechi amrinan harziru yatsa davke b'shahziru b'inyan she'achol adayin latzeit bo hayim yichziru la'achar she'avra mitzvato lo yatsa. What happens if I say, yes, matana menat lahachzir, here's the lulav and esrog, on condition you give it back to me. You say, fine. And 4 days later, after Simchas Torah, you give it back to me. It's still an esrog. Well, it's a citron, but it's no longer an esrog. I want an esrog that I can use as an esrog. I want the concept of esrog, because now in Torah, when we look at a chefza shel mitzvah, it's more like Moshe's golden Rolex that's been in the family for 4 generations. This particular thing has meaning beyond the commodity. An esrog has meaning beyond it being a citron. And when I said al manat lahachzir, I didn't mean give me back an empty citron. I meant give me back an esrog that I can still use on Sukkot. Lo yatsa den date hachayavi v'chazarat amim hacha vada elav chazorahi alulav kapit. And it doesn't help giving money back. Yes, the Rosh says, what difference does it make if you give back the Rolex or you give back the value of the Rolex, says the Ran, but that doesn't work with a lulav and esrog. You can't do the mitzvah with a few dollars in your hand. You can't do the mitzvah with the value. You need the thing. You need a lulav and esrog. And so when I say al manat lahachzir, I don't mean give me back the value. I mean give me back this lulav and esrog. And if you've been makdish it in that case, if you've given it away to hekdesh, surely that won't work. In fact, the Ran goes on. This is a beautiful Ran in Sukkah, and he says, ki amar al manat shetachzireu li hech yatzabo. In fact, if you go back to Rava's din about the Etrog, how can it even work if you say on condition you give it back to me? Now that we've learned Rav Ashi's din, that there's a difference between give it back and give it back to me. If I say give it back, even if I can't use it, you've given it back, you fulfilled the condition. But if I say give it back to me, which means give it back for me, give it back to me in a way that I can use it, if that's a requirement, then by giving you an esrog on condition you give it back to me in a form that I can use it, I am removing from you the authority to be makdish that esrog. If you can't be makdish that esrog, says the Ran from the very Gemara in Nedorim, then that's not a matana, that's not a gift. If it's not a gift, it was never lachem, it was never yours. Umipnei zeh katav Rabbeinu Shmuel zan sham b'Bava Batra de lo yasinan li. And that's why the Rashbam says, I couldn't find the Rashbam in our Rashbam, but he says the Rashbam takes that word li out of Rava's statement. That although we've got written with Omar Rava Etrog ze natun lecha b'matana al menat shetachzirehu li, the Rashbam takes the word li out, because li spoils the whole thing. By saying li, you've got to get the Etrog back in a way that is not mukdash, that it hasn't been given to the Beis HaMikdash, which means you have restricted ownership. Restricted ownership is not ownership at all. So even though a temporary ownership is full ownership, during that time you've got 100% ownership. Even the right to give it to the Beis HaMikdash. But if I take away the right to give it to the Beis HaMikdash, then I'm restricting your rights of ownership, and it's no longer called lachem. And so the Rashbam takes that out, says the Ran. And it's interesting, although I couldn't find it in the Rashbam, but I found Rabbeinu Asher Milunil. The Rabbeinu Asher Milunil is so interesting because he comes from that school that we've talking about, the school of the second Ravid. The second Ravid was the Rosh Yeshiva and the Dayan in Provence, in the south of France. He was a Talmud of the Baal HaMor, and this was a very innovative school. We've seen a lot of chidushim coming out of that school. The Baal HaMor was there, and the Rabbeinu Asher Milunil was there as well. Until very recently, we didn't know much about Rabbeinu Asher Milunil because we only had him referred to, we only had him quoted by other Rishonim. But there was a very wonderful Rav, I've spoken about him before, Reb Moshe Yehuda Bloy. Reb Moshe Yehuda Bloy was a Talmud in Mir. He escaped from there to Japan, and then to Shanghai, and then to New York. And in New York, he was a Rav for 50 years in New York. And he quietly, while he was a Rav, some Rabbonim have got a lot of time, and he used his time to become a superb scholar, a research scholar. And he found manuscripts, and he found Rishonim, he found some amazing things. And among them, he found the manuscript of Reb Asher Milunil. He found part of it in Cambridge, part of it in the Geniza in Cairo. And this back in the 1980s. That was the first time we had the full Rabbeinu Asher Milunil on Bava Batra. And Rabbeinu Ashi Milunil says, "Umizeh atan amrinan helech etrog zeh almanat shetachzireu yatsa, sharei yachol lakdisho o lachziro, sharei mukdash u'muchzar." Says Rabbeinu Ashi Milunil, what we learn in the case of the shor, of the ox, has to be applied also to the case of the esrog. Aval I amar almanat shetachzireu li, lo yatsa, sharei eno yachol lakdisho. Then he's not yotze if you say li, because then you're not able to be makdish. It just so enriches the way we look at objects, at things, or you're looking at the thing, or you're looking at its dimensions, or you're looking at its economic value, or you're looking at its spiritual meaning. Those are three different dimensions of every object you look at. The object has a thing. You look at a sefer. The sefer is a book. You can go and buy it. You can replace it. It's a commodity. But it's also much more than that. It might have an inscription in it, which makes it an item of specific value to a specific person. It has spiritual value. Where do you place it? You put it on the top of the pile of Sforim, or do you put it lower down? It has specific meaning. It has to be treated with kedusha. There's a whole nother dimension to objects once one understands this and relates to objects in this way. What's important is just lamaisa. So what happens on Sukkot? You have to be very careful not to say to somebody, yes, here's my lulav, you may lose my lulav, and condition you give it back to me. That's a dangerous thing to say, isn't that right? Because now you're actually making not a matana. Such a little thing just by saying, you've got to say, here's my lulav, on condition you give it back. Don't say to me. Fortunately, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't paskin like the Rabbeinu Ashi Milunil and like the Ran in the Dorim. The Shulchan Aruch paskins, the Ramo says, "Mutar latet lo etrog b'matana almanat shelo yakdishena." Based on the Ran further on, the Ran goes on to say this idea that if you can't be makdish it isn't yours, is not so clear. And it's possible that even if you cannot be makdish it can be a full matana, and that's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins and the Mogen Avrom paskins that way. Sometimes I wonder, they did see the Ran, obviously. I'm sure they didn't see the Rabbeinu Ashi Milunil, or they might not have seen the Rabbeinu Ashi Milunil. I wonder if that would have made a difference to them. But certainly in our Gemara, the Girsa is left as li. Nobody's taken that out and said you mustn't have li in that Girsa. The Girsa is left as it is li. Despite the comments of the Ran and the Rabbeinu Ashi Milunil, the li is left. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that way, so you don't have to worry on Sukkot. If you do say give it back to me, it's still okay, but it's far better to say on condition you give it back, not to say on condition you give it back to me, because what you're wanting is to give the person full rights over the gift. The gift is temporary. You've got to give it back to me, but while it's yours, it's completely yours. And even that idea, to understand that there can be something that's called temporary ownership, but the temporary ownership is 100% ownership. During that time, you've got full ownership of that. And sometimes we have to understand that when we give things to people, we give authority to people, that even though it can be a temporary authority, during that time you've got to leave them alone to do what they want, because you've given them that authority, it belongs to them, and the matana is a complete matana, it's a complete and entire gift.